which have been honoring the 7 foundations of life right across World Unity Week. It's a tremendous honor to be here today with Susan Irick and Rutendo Ngara. Welcome, both of you, to World Unity Week.
Thank you.
Welcome, Rutendo.
Thank you so much.
Yes.
Thank you very much.
And we're very much looking forward to your insights and sharing today about this very important topic for all of humanity. We are going to begin with a little blessing video from Jyoti Ma, who's made a special video for these foundations of life, as in context also about the importance of sacred territories. Let's go to Jyoti.
Oh, Mother, Father, God, I'm calling on you as we look at this day, a foundation of life, a biodiversity. I'm thinking of our original people and how they're holding and caring for the last remaining biodiverse cultural regions on this Mother Earth. Let us all stand up and join them as they stand for protection of all life. All life is sacred. This is the magic moment when we can become collaboratively weavers of a new time. Let our biodiverse intelligence awaken in every single one of us. Let this creation do the weaving she came to do. This is my prayer. This is my prayer. This is my prayer.
Beautiful. Thank you, Jyoti Ma. And we also have dear brother Sunil Chauhan joining us from the Himalayas in northern India. Sunil, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you. So glad to be here. I was having some challenges with the electricity and internet, and just at 5:30, I've got my electricity. So how wonderful. It's good signs.
Okay. What we might do, Sunil, is I'm going to do an introduction of all of the distinguished panelists briefly, and we might come to you first, just to answer the question, how do we restore right relationship with biodiversity? But let me just do a brief introduction. Susan Irick, known as a pioneering conservationist, Dr. Susan B Irick is a licensed psychologist, biologist, writer, and practical visionary. She blends insights from nature and human psychology into a new way of understanding our relationship to our Earth and all living beings. She founded Earthfire Institute, Wildlife Sanctuary, and Retreat Center in 1999 to serve as a global model for wildlife and land preservation. Her message focuses on actionable ways to heal our relationship to nature and ourselves. It's a great honor to have you with us, Susan. Rutendo Ngara is an African indigenous knowledge systems practitioner and transdisciplinary researcher from Southern Africa whose professional interests have spanned from clinical engineering, healthcare technology management, socio-economic development, mathematics, leadership, and fashion design. Wow. To the interface between science, culture, cosmology, and paradigms of healing. She's a co-founder of Ancient Wisdom Africa, a forum that seeks to gather knowledge and voices of ancient wisdom and see how these can illuminate the present. She's also the chairperson of the Credo Mutwa Foundation, non-profit organization aimed at decoding and promoting the multidimensional works of African polymath Credo Mutwa. All of our panelists have very long and distinguished bios, so I'm doing abridged versions just so we can hear more from them directly. Sunil Shaohan is a wandering mountain man whose heart and spirit lies in nature. He travels the length and breadth of the Himalayas, deepening his relationship with nature, as well as engaging in dialogue with communities to bring meaningful social change using various tools, including nature-based spirituality. He's been part of setting up various social enterprises and initiatives over the last 2 decades, right across the Trans-Himalayas in various Himalayan states. We are very, very honored to have all of you joining us today. So enough of me. We want to hear from you. And we want to start with you, Sunil, which is really, how do we restore right relationship to biodiversity?
Thank you, Ben. Thank you. And greetings to the fellow panelists and all the people who are present here to listen to this discussion. The restoring the right relationships to biodiversity is a very integral part of the larger picture of looking at what we have been going through over the last 6-7 days, about the foundations of life. Because biodiversity is the link that really connects everything, just like yesterday's discussion in which we talked about climate and how climate is so, the platform for the dance of all the elements, so water, air, fire, everything comes together and merges into this wonderful play, where the consciousness of climate begins to shower us with all its goodness and well-being. And I think biodiversity is exactly the same. When you look at biodiversity, it starts with the habitats. And I've lived most of my life, in the high altitudes of the Himalayas. My home was at 3,800 meters above sea level for a very long period of time, almost 14 years. And this is a cold desert and a very unique habitat, a very unique biodiversity in terms of the habitat diversity that it has. And my birthplace was the Middle Himalayas, which is a very different habitat altogether. So even for me to adapt to that high altitude habitat, I started to engage with that habitat diversity. And as a consequence, looking at the species diversity that, is a consequence of the habitat diversity. So the first, step is to start looking at how do we restore our relationships with habitats before we can move into the next stage of species, And this is where the trick lies, because the habitats are so in sync with climate. Whether it's a rainforest, whether it's a coral ecosystem, whether it's the high altitude cold deserts, whether it's the Gangetic plains or the Amazon, everything is so interlinked to climate in that sense. So, there is this interweaving that happens between all these foundations of life that we've been talking about and discussing. And herein, the importance of looking at how the habitat diversity is so crucial in looking at preserving the species diversity. And if you look at places like the high altitude trans-Himalayan areas, the species diversity is very limited as opposed to places like the Amazon, the rainforests or the coral reef, where the species diversity is amazing because the habitat diversity is a lot. And the importance of looking at habitat again becomes even more pronounced, because in these particular zones, we have a very significant, we have a very, very, very important role of the biocultural traditions over there, which are interlinked to the habitats. For example, in places like the Spiti Valley, where I've lived for most of my time, in terms of the work that happens, the connection of people towards the habitat is very, very engaging on a day-to-day basis. So water, for example, is a scarce resource, and people have water rights over there rather than land rights. So it doesn't matter how much land you own. What matters is how much water rights you have. And people can have 100 acres of land, and someone can have 10 acres of land, but the water distribution happens in a manner that the ratio of division of land usage becomes very different. So the importance of looking at all these elements and how people engage with these elements becomes important. And here, if we move to the species diversity from here, the species over there play such an integral role. In my experience in living in the high altitudes, we realized that with climate change, the effect it had on species, for example, the bees and the flowers, they started to change their timings. The flowers were blossoming at a different time. The bees didn't know when to come in and play their role. As a consequence, the flora started to get affected. As a consequence of that, the herbivores started to get affected, and the entire cycle of the species diversity starts to get affected. And a lot of it is, it's human induced, of course, but it is also specific to the context in terms of the habitat diversity that you have. So in terms of the high Himalayas, the effect is something different, where this particular linkage that one species, that the timing change of flowers when they blossom changes the entire cycle of relationships that the species have. And that breaks the entire chain of the resilience that the land has, the habitat has, and the robustness that the land has. So the species importance in biodiversity is so integral in terms of managing and maintaining and keeping the resilience alive of the land. And from species, you move on to genetic diversity. And even on this particular platform, if you look at all the different people, the genetic diversity is so evident, from the color of the skin to the color of the eyes to the shape of the hair so the genetic diversity. So the species diversity and the genetic diversity adds robustness and resilience to the ecosystem that further nurtures, the way everything interacts interconnectedly with each other, whether it's humans who are part of that biodiversity, in terms of the species diversity, we are part of that biodiversity, but somehow I think we have excluded ourselves from that entire dialogue that happens in that space, in the natural space. So how do we reintroduce ourselves back into that dialogue? Like a World Unity Week of Trees, for example, hosted by them, where they're dialoguing about what do they need to do in this moment when these challenges are there. So how do we get invited into that dialogue? I know some people are already listening to that, they're already there listening to what the biodiversity has to say, what Earth has to say, and communicating their messages. But one of the things that I feel can restore the right relationships with biodiversity, or larger with nature as such, is reconnecting with it. I think the ability that we have to listen needs to be expanded manifold. And perhaps we can start with understanding how we can communicate with nature through silence, through being a little more slower, to give it time to engage with it, to spend time in a manner that you can begin to listen to it. What is the tree, for example? So for example, when I'm saying that they are also having this communication, what are they talking about? What is their engagement? How do we communicate with them? And in a slightly conscious community, for example, in people who are already asking these questions, this doesn't seem a very undoable task. But there is a large mass of people who are disconnected to the extent that they've lost complete connection. So the idea of living in four walls is extremely okay for people without having access to open spaces. And the majority of the population, now that they're living in that kind of space, slowly that relationship is getting broken. So when the relationship is broken, it's obvious that we're talking about a broken home, because the relationship sustains the whole family together. All relationships are getting broken, and a broken home leads to a whole range of other effects. It leads to disease, it leads to unease of being, it creates conflict in the house amongst the family members. So the larger family is in conflict here. So to mend that relationship, to mend that, and let's just take some examples. If the trees were having this plenary, for example, what are they discussing? Are they feeling the pain of their other trees? The forest fires, for example, in Australia in 2019, 500 million trees were burnt in that. How do you reconcile with that? How do you start to heal the trauma, that is going on in nature? How do you start there? What is the process for that? And I think the first and foremost step in that is to approach nature in a way that you're willing to listen, willing to engage in a silent dialogue with it, to reconnect with it in a manner that you can begin to sort of start feeling what it is that it wants from us as part of their system, as part of that ecosystem. And while we can reconnect the masses who are disconnected, I think the other way to restore right relationship with biodiversity and all the foundations of life is to look at the people who are already living in that relationship in a continued tradition. So what does the past hold for us? What wisdom do they have who have a continued lineage, where the relationship has never got broken, where the chain is still intact? Take, for example, again, in the place that I'm living in, and it's just an example from how everything is honored from nature when you start anything. From planting the first seed, you do a celebration of all the elements, you pray to them, you honor them. When you harvest, you again have a festival where you first honor them again. When you chant, for example, in the Buddhist monasteries, where the people who live there from the Buddhism that has adopted the biodivine traditions of that area. So when we look at the biocultural heritage and its relation to biodivinity, for example, it is so interlinked, and it's so profoundly presented to the masses, for the future generations, in terms of not having to re-engage in the way I'm mentioning for those who are disconnected, but just to continue that tradition. So in a monastery, when the prayers happen, the first thing is that they blow the conch shell. And the conch shell is basically invoking the water element. And from the water element, people move on into playing the drums, which is the earth element, connecting directly with the heart. From that, they move on to the cymbals. And the cymbals is the fire element. Then the flute comes in, the air element. And at the end, there's the gong, ether. Each and every element is invoked before any prayer is done. And so this biodivinity that is being honored, through every action in their lives, from sowing the seed to praying in a monastery. So the connections in the lives of these people are so intense. To revisit these connections, to come and learn from these. So a lot of the times, when we are approaching the idea of right relationships, or the idea of looking at how do we resolve this, how do we reclaim our space, for example, how do we find the collective consciousness with all the other relatives, all the other mass of things that exist. I think one of the ways to do that is to look at the ancient wisdom that is there, not just in nature, but also in the custodians of nature, those who have a continuous lineage. So these are some of our space, our role in nature, because we've also lost somewhere what role and what purpose do we serve in this thing. So the other narrative that I feel that exists, which when I encounter a lot of people on the ground, when we're talking to people, for a lot of the people, the narrative is that if Homo sapiens have managed as a species to become the dominant species, why should we ignore, the space that we have got? Why should we let go of this privilege? Why shouldn't we continue to remain the dominant species? And the word is dominant.
1 minute, brother. 1 minute.
Yeah. So the idea is, again, looking at reconnection. I think the word for me, that I think that can help us to restore the right relationships with biodiversity or with the foundations of life is reconnecting with nature. And I think I'll rest at that moment, with that. Thank you, Ben.
Sunil, thank you so much. That was awesome. What a brilliant opening, sharing and beginning. So many profound reflections and ideas contained within there. I love to explore more this idea of biodivinity and the nature and the traditions of the Himalayas and also the Buddhist traditions that you're referring to. Fantastic opening, Sunil. Thank you so much for being with us. We hope that the internet and the electricity will allow you to stay throughout the rest of the discussion. So, Susan, let's come to you and then on to Rutendo. So, Susan Irick, how can we, building upon what Sunil has said and your own deep experience in this field, how can we restore right relationship to this foundation of life that is biodiversity?
Well, first, I'd like to say that yes to everything that Sunil said. Not only yes, but actually I coined a term, reconnection ecology, which is the exact same line of understanding that Sunil brought up. So I'd like to start very briefly. So I'm located in the Rocky Mountains of the United States, and I have a wildlife sanctuary there, and I have animals that are native to the area. So I had 2 black bears, and they were brothers, and they were very, very close. They grew up together, and then one became ill and passed away. And we do retreats, and a student from California came and was interested. For some reason, she wanted to draw this bear called Huckleberry Bear. And she was sitting in front of his enclosure. And suddenly she began to feel very sad. And she thought, this is really strange. And then she found tears running down her face. She thought, this is really strange. This is a girl from California, from Los Angeles, sitting in front of a bear. And then she sort of heard in her head, I miss my brother. And she thought to herself, this is really, really weird because I don't have a brother. But she felt a sadness, and she promised that she would come back and visit him every single day that she was still there. And when she made that promise, he turned around and went back into his den. And that night, she asked, when you're around the campfire, when you dare say things that you don't during the day, she said, did Huckleberry have a brother? She didn't know. So there was a bear communicating his sadness to a human being who he didn't even know, but she was open because she had no expectations at all. And to me, I like that story because the implications are so profound. What is it that you can connect that way? And he initiated the connection and she received it. What's the implication of what's possible for us? And yes, it's a bear. But I've had those experiences with quite a few of the animals at the sanctuary, a cougar or a wolf. And my sense is that it's possible anywhere with any other living being. We're just not open to it. Or we don't know that it's even possible. So how can we restore right relation to to expand our sense of community to truly include all living beings. That means truly include them as equal. I have something here called, so if all life is sacred, which I believe it is, it's a radical statement for many people, as Sunil was referring, for a lot of people, that's quite radical. But if we believe it, it means a profound reordering of how we live, consume, and function together as a society. But we need this radical shift to solve our ecological and social crises. Human consciousness must expand to connect with all life, with its multitude of wisdoms, intelligences, and spirit. We need to connect deeply, fall in love with other life forms. That connection opens channels through which flows information and strength and healing, and leads to creative, practical solutions. So connection versus disconnection, every connection is critical. I understand that we have to use the word biodiversity because it's a huge topic and it's an abstraction. But anytime we do an abstraction, we as human beings are in danger of losing our grounding. And we can talk in the abstract and we can lift ourselves away, so to speak, or stay just in the front of our brain. So when we say biodiversity, it's helpful to really picture what that means. Not just all the other species, but all the individuals of those species. We're talking about something living and vibrant, not just an abstraction. And to be able to combine those two is really important. But why is it so important to restore right relations? Well, without it, we're orphaned. We're alone. We're disconnected. We're become unbalanced. We're lost. We're up in the air. We're ungrounded. We can't lead. We can easily destroy because it doesn't mean anything. So connection is everything, that we are part of the whole. How can we unite as humanity? It's not a very popular idea, but one thing we must do is hold each other accountable. And that includes corporations and criminal gangs and all of it. To the extent we let people get away with being abusive, we lose. And it's difficult because the abusers, whether they're corporations or criminal gangs or a man or a woman in a family, tend to be very focused. And the rest of us just want to live our lives. And we're not that focused on getting something done. And that way it doesn't, we don't stand up against the energy of the focused negative. To help ourselves do that is really important. To show a positive path forward, to speak to the best of us. My own feeling is that we have both capacities, but we are incredible beings. Our capacity for music and compassion and art and beauty and brilliance, we are incredible, a huge beauty in us. And if we can help ourselves focus on that more than the negative, and as most of us know, our brains are wired for the negative for obvious survival reasons. We have to help ourselves overcome that with our media, negative, overcome our wiring for biological survival, to balance that with also caring for others. We can do that. We can do it through education. We can do that through leadership. We can do that through art. But it's out of balance, the negative versus the positive. The positive is there everywhere. Life itself is a joy. It's fantastic. It's an absolute celebration of existence. As every single time something new is born, be it a seed or a baby, it comes, it's embodied in this incredible opportunity. So it's everywhere, but we're not looking at it. And we're not celebrating it. We're not focusing on it. We're focusing on narrow problems. Now, I shouldn't say narrow because water is not narrow. Air is not narrow. Fixing plastic is not narrow. But we have to look at the whole as well, or else we're not going to be able to, from that frame of reference, be able to make the decisions we need to make about how to deal with the specific issues we have to deal with. So another thing, is a useful thing to do, is to envision the world as we want it, not focus on all the negative and all the terrible problems that obviously we have to deal with them, but to focus on the vision of how we want it. And from there, begin to deal with all of the issues with that understanding and that energy and intent to heal. Sunil mentioned trauma, and yes, I think the entire human race is traumatized, as are most animals at this point. So how to begin to heal from trauma. There's wonderful new studies and research on the trauma and the effect on the brain and the intergenerational trauma and how to begin to heal that. That's a really, really important, because a lot of the negative stuff comes from that. And then from a more moral point of view, as a Native American friend of mine asks, he says, what is our obligation? What is our responsibility? And that obligations are a positive thing, like the obligations of love. What are our obligations to the earth and to each other? To begin to focus on that rather than what we can get, which is a very Western thing to do, to begin to focus on what are our obligations to give. And something that I always found very powerful was a gentleman was sitting under a tree once meditating and shared with me that the earth was speaking to him. And there was a conference, and it was human focused, as almost all conferences are, because that's how we're wired. And we need to overcome the human focus and think larger. And she said, the earth said to him, don't forget about me. And we do, in terms of how focused we are on our own issues. Even at the beginning, we said, how will this talking about diversity help humans? No. How is it going to help all life? We're not separate from all life. And it's really hard because we're so trained that way, and our society is so much that way. It's hard for us to remember. We need to help one another remember. Wait a minute, think larger. Wait a minute, keep all of life in mind. Wait a minute. Because it's so easy for us to get lost in a worry or fear or needs or status or all that stuff, because we're wired that way. It's so easy. And yet we can support one another in small groups around the world, conversations like this. And another question that arose when that gentleman was sitting under the tree was the idea of, what if the earth is lonely for us? What a wonderful way to live if you understand that maybe she's lonely for us, lonely for the connection. I was going to read something very briefly and then I'll be finished. So a child crawls towards a puppy, inexorably drawn, and the puppy responds. We go to the forest for solace, sensing the peace that resonates from a harmonious community of life forms. We receive it. Life recognizes life. Life is drawn to life. Life exalts in life. Connection with life, any life form, creates a glow. In that connection, energy flows and we are healed. This is our inheritance, what we instinctively know, what helps us thrive. This is what we have been torn from as we live in an increasingly soulless, frantic, man-made world. This is what we can and must return to. Thank you.
Susan, thank you. Beautiful. And connection ecology is something we can all learn more about. Your incredible contribution and falling in love with nature. What a beautiful, beautiful invitation. There's a comment in the chat from Elena Mustakova, Susan, that says, so powerful to point out the need to hold each other accountable. Eco-crimes numb us. Thank you. We are indeed so orphaned, we've even lost sense of it. So thank you very much, Susan. We'll have some time to come back to you for some more reflections as we go forward. Okay, now our third speaker we're very excited to bring up is Rutendo Ngara. Rutendo, you've heard from Sunil and from Susan. How would you add to that, or what would you offer in terms of how do we do this important work of getting back into right relationship with this biodiversity as a foundation of life?
Thank you so much, Ben. And it is such a pleasure to sit in the circle of this esteemed panel with the incredible inputs from Sunil and Susan. And I can only weave in within the tapestry of their wisdom. I'm mindful that today we had this 5 planetary alignment when Mercury and Venus and Mars and Jupiter and Saturn lined up in the sky in a planetary order with the crescent moon. And I believe this reminded us of the unity of diversity. And from our indigenous African perspective, each of these celestial bodies actually represent core principles that work in complementarity with each other in an interconnected, interdependent, and interrelated manner, reminding us of mutual duality. And I believe that many lessons in right relationship can come from the indigenous way, that way that recognizes this interconnectedness, interrelatedness, and interdependence of all facets of creation. That which reminds us that when nature speaks, as we heard from Susan, the indigenous way is to listen. That which reminds us that the way to recognize that Mother Earth and her fiery core of Grandfather Geb are not isolated from the whole, whether it is the microcosm or the macrocosm, whether it is the microscopic pathogenic world, or whether it is the solar system, the galaxy, the universe, and beyond, that this sentient being both serves and is served by the whole. And following the indigenous way is to uphold the precursor of nature, which we call here neter. And this is the all-pervasive force that pervades, persists, and subsists through all that is and all that is not. It is the creator, the created, and the uncreated. It is the undefined, the formless, the nothingness that is at the same time the underlying factor of all objects in the world. And the indigenous way is to hold this paradox. It is to uphold the sacredness of nature and to be both restorative and regenerative, where desecration may have occurred. And in serving the biodiversity of this incredible place that we are, this Mother Earth, the indigenous way is to recognize that our part in the cosmos, as opposed to the anthropocentric view, that we are not a part of, but we are a part, we're not apart from, but we are a part of. And so I believe that many lessons in right relationship can come from the incredible diversity of existence. And I believe that restoring right relationship requires humanity to humble itself to the myriad facets of being. So drawing from nature, I believe lessons in right relationship can also come from the sentience of rivers, whether it is their intricate network of tributaries, whether it is their connecting streams, their lakes, their springs, their pools, their deltas, their waterfalls, or how they move into the ocean. But why am I talking about rivers? Because certainly here in Africa, the ancient ones, the sages, the wise ones tell us that everything is a teacher. Knowledge lies everywhere, and in all things lies wisdom. And rivers, in as much as they are part of nature, are one of the infinite manifestations of this that we call neter. And if wisdom lies everywhere, what is the wisdom that they seek to impart? While there are many rivers in the world, and each has their own character and teaching, I have a favorite, or one of my favorites, which is the Niger River. And I'd just like to tell the story of the Niger River and hope it can illustrate something around our topic today. So the Niger River has its source in the Guinea Highlands, about 240 kilometers from the Atlantic Ocean. And science would tell us that it should follow this short route of 240 kilometers from the highlands to the lowland into the ocean. And yet, the Niger River does something else. It moves inland in a northeasterly direction, deep into the interior of the Sahara Desert in Mali. And once it is in the desert, instead of following its course towards the Mediterranean Sea, it suddenly makes a surprising right turn near the city of Timbuktu, and it follows a meandering journey through Niger, through Benin, through Nigeria, before it eventually discharges into the Atlantic Ocean at the Gulf of Guinea. So what should have been a 240-kilometer journey to the ocean instead becomes a sinuous, crescent-shaped 4,180-kilometer river of water. And this is inefficient, this route, because along the way, the gradient drastically decreases, it reduces the flow potential, and suddenly it precipitates a very slow and sluggish trek towards the ocean. But the result of this loss of potential becomes the formation of the Niger Delta. And this Niger Delta is a series of braided streams of marshes and lakes that are as large as Belgium. And the Niger Delta is the largest wetland in our continent in Africa. and third largest in the world, with an ecosystem that contains one of the highest concentrations of biodiversity on the planet. And apart from supporting abundant rainforest flora and fauna, it has large stretches of arable land that sustains a diverse agricultural system. It is home to more than 30 million people, made up of 40 different ethnic groups. But unfortunately, this inefficient but effective, or fortunately, this inefficient but effective river is actually a wellspring of diversity and of nourishment. So I believe we can learn from this ineffective or inefficient effectiveness of the Niger River as in taking the route less traveled. But tragically, what we do know about the Niger is that this diversity could soon be destroyed because of extensive dam construction, poisoning of the waters due to oil spills, and other conflicts. And so this delta, this incredible biodiverse space, is slowly becoming uninhabitable by flora, fauna, and humans alike. And together with the casualties of conflict due to ongoing competition for oil and its associated wealth, unfortunately, the delta is giving in to the atrocity of ecocide. And I believe that this river speaks to us about the indigenous way that we spoke about earlier. Because rivers are meandering, they move through nooks and crannies, they traverse nuances, they examine all contours, they collect, they deposit, they nourish, they nurture, they feed, they cleanse, in order to acquire the fullness of diversity, the full body of knowledge. And apart from the limits of the banks which give the rivers form, they go beyond boundaries. They move with gravity and sometimes venture against it. They come in multiple forms and traverse many mediums. They are not limited by disciplines, but they're limited by the great expanse of life and death. And like the Niger, they did not necessarily take the shortest route, that which would tell us is the most efficient route, but they take the most accommodating route. They take the most effective route. And therefore they take everything into consideration, and thus everything with them on the journey. And because of this, they're an oracle, they're a diviner, they're a seer. And this is the reflective, flowing aspect of nature, or neter. And so we learn from these rivers that our indigenous way and the knowledge and the knower and the praxis or the practice are one, they're united. But another lesson that I love from the Niger River is that in taking the way less travels, it seeks to find the other. It seeks to find the parched, dusty, arid plains of the Sahara. And so I believe that many lessons in right relationship can come from effective inefficiency. And many lessons in right relationship can come from seeing the other in the biodiverse universe in the mirror and realizing it is me, realizing it is you, realizing it is all that is, and realizing that it is neter. And in this realization, we then come into what we here in Africa is called the principle of Ubuntu. And Ubuntu sources from the all-pervasive force that is actually Ntu. And Ntu manifests in many, many forms. It manifests as the reasoned form, we, the humans, those that have reasoned beings. But it also manifests in those that have come before, the ancestors. It manifests in those that walk now, and it manifests in those that are yet to come. And so there's this interconnected web between all that is. But Ntu does not live only within the human form. Ntu manifests in all things, all unreasoned beings, all that is impacted upon by Muntu, which is the human being. And it includes trees. Muntu, the person, is a tree. The tree is a person within our Ubuntu cosmology. But it doesn't just end there. Ntu manifests itself in time and space in Hantu. It manifests itself in modalities, in the intangibles. And so when we follow this Ubuntu way, or this way of Ntu, then we realize that many lessons in right relationship can only come from being advocates for Ntu. I thank you.
Wow. Oh my goodness. That was absolutely amazing, Rutendo. Thank you so much. I love this the language nater. I want to understand more about the meanings behind it. In fact, we have some friends, Pato and Antoinette, who are coming to Africa to do a movie all about the different concepts of Ubuntu. I'd love to introduce you to them at some point. That was absolutely beautiful. I want to bring both of the other panelists back here, and if the co-hosts could mute those who need to be muted, I'd appreciate that. I'm going to bring Susan and Sunil back, and in the spirit of biodiversity, Bob and Noel, can you mute yourself? Sorry. We're going to bring everybody back and have a final conversation around everything that's been shared. And by the way, I love, in World Unity Week, we've been honoring eco-governance has played a very important role, and also honoring the nature elders. And it's striking to me that in our conversation today, we've had the Niger River and the Himalayas and the Rocky Mountains have all been very present in our discussion and our conversation today. So as we close in the spirit of biodiversity, Susan, Sunil, and Rutendo, what would you say as closing comments in terms of how can we more empower everybody is saying this same idea of re-enchantment, falling in love, being in the sacred wonder of being a part of this, infinite, beautiful creation. How can we accelerate, reinforce, reconnect, and go forward together in a strong way? Susan, I'm going to start with you.
Oh dear. It's a very difficult question. It does really need to start with ourselves. I know that's often a truism and isn't taken as seriously as it might be. But as we become more coherent with ourselves, just like I talked before about predators being more coherent than the rest of us, in a sense, as we become more coherent within ourselves, integrated within ourselves, we become more powerful as individual expressions. So it begins there, and taking the time to make the connections with nature. And really is very difficult, but we must hold ourselves and others accountable. Without that, we're lost if we let the larger forces of destruction take over. So to support one another and trying to hold one another accountable, and the negative forces are very strong. It takes a lot of courage as well. But this is someone just recently, I think it was you, Rutendo, who used the word the atrocity of ecocide. We can't be passive in this. We can't just go about our regular lives. We must take action, and whatever action it is, it's like whatever it is that we fall in love with, that's what we fight for, and then we find what our gifts are, and those are the gifts we use, and to support one another in that. The support is essential.
Beautiful, thank you, Susan. And Sunil, any reflections from you as to what's been shared today? And also thoughts about how we can reinforce and redouble our efforts to really turn the tide.
I think the word reverence has come quite often in the traditions that have happened. Reverence for life, children. And the idea of reconnection actually is a very powerful idea. So the relationships, when we talk about relationships, the first relationship we must learn is the relationship to ourselves. We have lost, that just the relationship with nature, but also how to build meaningful relationships with other people, our cultures, our traditions, everything. I think it starts there. The things I'd like to share is, for example, when I go out to the forest, or any natural landscape, I communicating with the fellow beings over there, our kin over there. And I remember this very recent conversation I had with a very elderly old, maybe about 600 years old. And it was quite a profound.
Brother, I'm going to come in here. We were hoping that it would get a bit better, but unfortunately your connection is beyond our ability to, and now he's gone. So Rutendo, with your final comments of reflections, that was, again, the panel has been absolutely exquisite in the depth of beauty and truth and honesty that's been expressed. Rutendo, your closing remarks about how we can connect up globally and reinforce, the visionary work that you are stewarding, that Susan is stewarding, and that thousands and thousands of leaders around the world are stepping forward in a strong way now. What can we do to further enhance that and to further connect up globally?
No, let's just have a good time.
Okay, let's have a good.
Thank you so much, Ben. I think, I would look into our ancestors and especially what our indigenous elders would do in taking the practice of circumspection. And what they taught us, they taught us to take a step back, to take a deep breath, and to survey the entire terrain. They taught us to take things apart and look at the outer differences, in the process of segregation. But they also taught us to put things together again, to look at the outer similarities in congregation. And then they went in depth and they looked at inner differences in analysis, or they integrated the core, looking at the inner similarities in synthesis. And so I think we need to have this analytical, synthetical, critical approach that our indigenous elders would have. They sought the truth that would withstand the scrutiny of the cosmic trickster and the scales of divine law. And so, for instance, if a king was affected, they would work on strengthening the warriors. And if the warriors were affected or afflicted, they would work on clearing the environment. They would clear the waterways, the meridians, which eventually lead to the king. And where the environment was affected, they looked to the stars. They communicated with different realms of being. They communicated with the ancestors and they divined. So I believe that we need to come into a bio-divining process in order to be able to fully integrate with the work that's being done as a whole and learn from our ancestors and learn from our elders.
Magnificent. Yes. Amen to everything you've shared, Rutendo. That's just so wonderful. There is an important question, Susan, maybe the last word will be for you. And this question is coming from Janice Dooley. And it's a really important one. How do you have any suggestions or ideas, Susan, on how we can get this key message out more widely than it is today? I know you're doing everything you can and a pioneer in the field, but do you have any other suggestions of what we as a community can do collectively to help get this critical message out more widely?
I think I go back again to individual action, even though it's a system that we have to change. To hold ourselves accountable, not just everyone else, to do everything we can to do that. And to interconnect with one another like this, like, for instance, perhaps Rutendo and I should be speaking together, for example, or the three of us should be speaking with one another and enhancing one another, the indigenous wisdom and the wisdom I have from the animals and the wisdom that Sunil has from living in the Himalayas. But I think most of all is to hold ourselves accountable to do everything we can.
Beautiful. To hold ourselves accountable and each other connected. Thank you, Susan. Sunil, you've come back. I just want to give you a moment to share a brief closing thought. Lindsay, you've got your hand up, but if you have a comment or a question, could you put it in the chat for us, please? We just have a short period of time left. Sunil.
I think one of the beauties of the World Unity Week is, like what Susan said, this connections, there's dialogues, this interweaving of different ideas and thoughts, also of the commonalities, the collective sort of reassurance that we get that, yes, these are the right approaches that we have. We're thinking in the right way. We're talking about the right relationships.
You want me to put in the chat?
And when we think about right, for example, we're also talking about rights for nature. I mean, a lot of the countries have adopted this model where they're saying that let the rivers have a right, let them have a right as we have the right. Since we are part of nature and we are looking at rights for ourselves, why not share these rights with other entities that are existing collectively to create this beautiful, beautiful existence that we have and all the benefits that we get from it? How do we share them more meaningfully? And sharing the privilege is the key. Inheritance is a beautiful privilege, but if we don't take the responsibility of sharing it meaningfully, I think then we lose that connection. And when we lose that connection, I think everything starts to just fall apart. And like it's being said again and again and again. I want to close it with a quick poem I heard from the oak. Just a couple of lines, and it's: the oak stood up and said this to the cedar: "Look, we all need her, and yet we bleed her." Thank you.
Beautiful. Thank you, Sunil. Thank you, Sunil. I notice Lindsay hasn't managed to get her question or comment in the chat, so I'm going to give you an opportunity, Lindsay, to say what you wanted to say. I notice you're on a phone, so it's a bit hard to type it all out. Go ahead, Lindsay.
Oh, okay, thank you so much. So I was in charge of sustainability for a college in New York City, and I participated in this rating system that's been very influential in creating change. And it's called ASHE Stars. And I was surprised to see that there was nothing in that rating system about preserving nature or about our relationship with nature. And so I've been working with, there's a group who's trying to incorporate the rights of nature into the Sustainable Development Goals from the UN. And I told them, why don't we try to get it into this sustainability rating system that colleges use? So anyway, so I've created this website called Redefine Sustainability. And there's a ladder of engagement for students from trying to change the definition of sustainability. So it includes thriving nature and the concept that nature is not just resources for us to use, but has its own intrinsic value. And then take a bunch of steps to try to actually infuse this into our culture and actually take steps into trying to preserve nature. And so if you want, I need people who are very eloquent. You guys are all eloquent, the speakers, but I wrote down my email address and the website address. Right now it's under password protection, but if you write to me, I'll tell you the password. But I think I've been just trying to
We can get that in the chat, Lindsay. Thank you.
Right.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thanks, everybody.
Congratulations and thank you. We'll take that as a comment.
Thank you.
Okay, wonderful. Well, I really, on behalf of World Unity Week and eco-governance and all of our community, really want to deeply thank you, Susan Irick, Rutendo Ngara, and Sunil Chauhan, for giving up your precious time to come and share these critical messages with us. We feel blessed and informed and enlightened by your wisdom, and we look forward to seeing you again. We are on a journey. This is just day 7 of 99 days of peace through unity, which is building up to Peace Week in September, which is our climax moment, which is the 40th anniversary of the International Day of Peace. So we hope that we will see you again, Susan, Rutendo, and Sunil, as we journey forward through these important moments and critical moments in our world's history. Thank you for being with us today in World Unity Week. I am going to close just with a beautiful message from Purpose Earth, our beloved sponsors of this event, the generosity to make this free to the world. All these incredible speakers from around the world are put on free through the generosity of Purpose Earth. So I'm going to play a video from our friends there.